So students, we're on lesson 1-4, which focuses on rounding. So you already watched your visual learning. We're just going to look at a quick little anchor chart that we have here to just remind us about rounding. So we're going to mark our place. We're going to look next door. If it's 5 or more, we're going to add one more. If it's 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. And all the numbers in front of it stay the same. All the ones behind it turn to 0. So we'll be referring to those throughout. So here's our first one. We're actually going to do this a little bit out of order. We're not going to do 1 and 2 first. We're actually going to start with number 3 first. So here, we're going to round each number to the place of the underlined digit. So what's it asking us to do? It's asking us to look at this digit right here, and we're going to be rounding that place value. So remember, we underline our digit, we go next door. If it is 5 or more, we add one more. If it's 4 or less, we let it rest, so it's going to stay the same. So is 9 5 or more? It's more. So that means it's going to add up to 1. We add 1 to it. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. And all the numbers to the left stay the same. Same thing here. 5 or more, we add one more. So let's look to the next. 9 is more than 5, so we're going to add one more. But we have this problem here. We have 9, and we're adding 1 to it. So what is 9 plus 1? Well, that's 10. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Our next one, I'm apparently doing the odd ones first. Underline your place value and go next door. 5 or more, you add one more. So we're going to add one more to 1. So 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So that's 2. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Now we go to our even numbers. So we underline our place value and we look next door. 5 or more, you add one more. So we need to add 1 to 3. So we're going to add 1 to 3, which is 4. Look to the right, put zeros in sight, and the numbers to the left stay the same. So we have 85,640. For number 6, we underline our place value, look to the right, 4 or more, or 5 or more, we add one more. 4 or less, we let it rest, so it's going to stay the same. So this 9 is going to stay the same. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. So everything to the right becomes a 0. Everything to the left stays the same. Our last one on this part, look to the right, 4 or less, we let it rest. So that means this one's going to rest. It's going to stay the same. Look to the right and put zeros in sight. So that number rounds to 100,000. Now let's head back over to these number ones. Now that we've done some rounding practice, let's see what we have. Explain how to round a number when 7 is the digit to the right of the rounding number. So let's just write an example really fast for us. We're going to say, let's round to the nearest 100. So let's just pick a number 1. We're rounding to that hundreds, and it says when a 7 is to the right of the place value. So it's asking us, how would we round this number? There's a 7 to the right of that place value. Well, what I'm going to do is I add 1, because remember, if it's 5 or more, we add one more. Add 1 to the rounding place value. And then what do we need to do? We change all the digits to the right to 0. So what would this number round to? Well, let's see. 5 or more, we add one more. So we'd have 1 plus 1 is 2. So that hundreds becomes a 2. So we have 200. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. So that number would round to 200. Now for question number 2. A city's population is 421,906. Round it to the nearest 100,000 and to the nearest 1,000. So it's asking us to do 2 separate roundings. So let's look at this first part. 400,000. So we underline our place value and we go next door. Is that 2, 5 or more? So we add one more. Or is it 4 or less? So we let it rest so it stays the same. That 2 is less, so we're going to let it rest. So that will become 400,000. We let that 4 rest and then look to the right, put zeros in sight. For this next one, we're going to round to the nearest 1,000. So we're going to underline that place value and we go next door. That 9 is 5 or more, so we need to add 1 to it. So we have 9 plus 1 is 10. So this is our tricky part. Our tricky part is Mr. Wimbley just made a mistake. So we're not adding 9 to 1. Our place value is 1 for the thousands, and we add 1 to it. So that's our tricky part. Make sure you're adding the right number. You're adding to that place value. So we have 2, oops. So we have 2. So what is this number going to be? It's going to be 422,000, that place value. We added 1 more. And then look to the right, put zeros in sight. Okay, we're going to head to our next problems. These ones we're going to do a little bit faster, all right? So I'm going to make my note for us. 5 or more, we add 1 more. 4 or less, we let it rest. So let's check. Right next door, that's 4 or less, so we're going to let it rest. So that stays a 9. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. My next one, go next door. That is 5 or more, so we need to add 1 to this 3. So that's going to be a 4. And then look to the right, put zeros in sight. Now for number 11, we look to the right. That's 5 or more, so we put zeros in sight after we add 1. So on to number 12. So remember, what we're doing is we're rounding, so we go next door. So we're going next door, and remember, we're seeing if it's 5 or more, then we add 1 more. If it's 4 or less, we let it rest, which means it stays the same. So that is 5 or more, so I'm going to add 1 to my place value. And oops, Mr. Wimbley was looking at the wrong one. Sorry about that, guys. So we're going next door, and that is 4 or less. So we're going to let this 8 rest. Let me go back. So this 8 is going to stay the same. Everything to the right becomes zeros. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left is going to stay the same. So that number rounds to this. Our next one, number 13, go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add 1 more. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. Our next one, look to the right. 4 or less, we let it rest. So this 6 is going to stay the same. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Heading on to our next one. Go next door. 4 or less, we let it rest. So this 3 is going to rest and stay the same. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. Number 16. Look to the right. 4 or less, we let it rest. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. Now number 17. Look to the right. 5 or more, we add 1 more. This one's a little tricky though, because we have 9, and when we add 1 more, it becomes 10, which is 2 digits instead of 1. So all that means is this 9, I'm just replacing it with a 10. And then look to the right, so everything to the right, we put zeros in sight. So this is my ones period. This is my thousands period. This is my millions period. So this number rounds to 1 million. Number 55. Look to the right. 4 or less, we let it rest. So that 5 is going to rest and stay the same. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. And to the left stays the same. That number rounds to 55,000. This next one, go next door. 4 or less, we let it rest. So this 2 is going to rest and stay a 2. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. This 3 is to the left, and that will stay the same. Remember, to the right will always be zeros, to the left will stay the same. Go next door. 5 or more, we add one more. So we're adding 1 to this 4. So that becomes a 5. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. So this number rounds to 417,550. Next one, go next door. 5 or more, we add one more. So this will become a 7. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. So a lot of this is just practice over and over and over. Go next door. 4 or less, we let it rest. So this 4 is going to rest and stay a 4. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. Our next one, go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add one more to our place value. So this becomes an 8. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Next one, go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add one more. So that will become a 2. Look to the right, put zeros in sight, and everything to the left stays the same. Our next one, we have one more row after this row. We look next door. It's 4 or less, so we let it rest. So this 2 is going to rest and stay a 2. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Number 26, go next door. It's 4 or less, so we let it rest. So this 9 is going to rest and stay as 9. It's going to stay the same number, and then we look to the right, put zeros in sight. This next one, we go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add 1. What is 9 plus 1? Well, that's 10. So I'm just rewriting it as 10 right here. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add one more. So this becomes a 7. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. This is our last row for these kind of problems. Then we're going to go to the next page to do some word problems. All right, we go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add one more. So 7 plus 1 is 8. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Our next one, we go next door. It's 4 or less, so we let it rest. So this 1 is going to stay a 1. It's going to rest and stay the same. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same. Our next one, this one's a little bit tricky. We go next door. It's 5 or more, so we add one more. So, whoops. So we add one more. But what do we notice? This becomes a 10. So this would be a 10, so 10 would be a 0 here. And we're regrouping that 1, just like we do if we were adding a regular number. We can't just put a 10 here because we have this 9 to also deal with. So we're regrouping that 1 up here. And now what do we have? We have 9 plus 1 is 10. So we'd regroup that 1 as well. And then we have 1 plus 2 is 3. And then look to the right, put zeros in sight. So this number actually rounds to 30,000. All the numbers and all the digits you'll notice had changed in that one example. And our last one of these kind of problems, go next door is 4 or less, so we let it rest. So this 2 is going to rest and stay the same. Look to the right, put zeros in sight. Everything to the left stays the same as well. All right, hopefully you're good with those kind of practice problems. We did tons of them, so now we're going on to our word problems. So here we're at a zoo. It says for each zoo in the table, round the attendance to the nearest 100,000. So here it's saying 100,000, so I'm going to underline that 100,000 place value. And now let's see what we have. So I'm going to go next door. Remember, if it's 5 or more, then we add one more. If it's 4 or less, then we let it rest, meaning it stays the same. So here I see that 3 is 4 or less, so it's going to rest. So zoo D is going to be 200,000. That 2 stays the same. Zoo E, we go next door. That's 5 or more, so I need to add 1 to this 8. So what is 8 plus 1? Well, that is a 9. And then look to the right, put zeros in sight. Our last one, zoo E or zoo F, we go next door. That's 5 or more, so we need to add one more. So what is 3 plus 1? Well, that is 4. And then we look to the right, and we put zeros in sight. Heading on to number 34. It says, write 4 numbers that round to 700,000 when rounded to the nearest 100,000. So we need to think, what numbers could round to 700,000 if we're at the nearest 100,000? Well, let's start with a super easy one. I know if I go next door and I want this to stay a 7, it needs to be 4 or less. So I'm going to pick a 2 because that's less than 4. And then it doesn't matter what all these other numbers are because they will become 0 anyways. So now if I went next door, this 2 is 4 or less, so it would round down to 700,000. Let's use this same idea for another. I have 7 and I need a number that's 4 or less. Well, let's just pick 4. And then remember, it doesn't matter what all these other numbers are because I don't use these place values to round, so I'm going to put all 9s there. Now, what about a harder one? What if I wanted it to round up? So it would need to be 5 or more. If I did that with a 7 right here, then notice how this is going to round to an 8, which then wouldn't be 700,000. So it needs to be a number 1 less, which would be 6. Now if I have a 6 in the 100,000 spot, then I just need a number that's 5 or more. So let's use the number 5. And then same thing, it doesn't matter what numbers I put in for the rest of them. If I go next door, then that's going to be adding 1 more for my rounding. And my last one, I'm going to just do 6, and I'm just going to pick 9, because I know 9 will round up. And I'm going to make it similar to the one that's right above it right here, and just fill the rest in with 9. There's 4 numbers. As long as you have a number that is between 650,000 and 749,999, any of those numbers would work, as long as it's between those. Number 35. A forest ranger correctly rounded the number of visitors to the park to be 120,000 visitors. Write a number that could be the actual number of visitors if he rounded to the nearest 10,000. So we need to think, what could be this 2? So what we just talked about in that last problem, I'm going to just say we're going to round down. So it's going to rest, which means this number next to it needs to be 4 or less. So let's pick the number 4. Now when I round down, that 2 is going to stay the same, and everything to the right will become 0. So that isn't a possible answer for that attendance. It would round down to 120,000. Number 36. Amy counted the number of boys and girls at the party. She recorded the results in the tally chart below. How many more boys than girls were at the party? Well, here I see there's 7 boys and 3 girls. So what is that? How many more? We would have 7 minus 3 equals 4. If I'm using a tape diagram that we'll use more of, this would be 3. I know this one right here needs to be bigger because it has 7, and I can see if it's broken up into 7, this part would be the same amount because they're both 3's, which means 3 plus what mystery number equals 7? It would need to be 4. Heading on to number 37. Liz attended class every day since she started school as a kindergartner. She said that she has been in school for 1,000 days. What numbers could be the actual number of school days if Liz rounded to the nearest 10? So right here we have this right nearest 10 spot. So it doesn't tell us, it just says what numbers. So I'm going to pick more than one answer. So I need something that rounds to 1,000. Well, if I have this number right here going to the nearest 10s, and I go next door, I'll see that rounds because I'll need to add 1 more because it's 5 or more, and then that will become a 10, and I'd have to regroup that 1. 9 plus 1 is 10, everything to the right. So that's one possible answer. So that's if I'm rounding up. What if I'm rounding down? 4 or less. So that means I need to have a 0 in the 10 spot, and something next door to it needs to be 4 or less. So let's pick a 3. So now I need the rest to be 1,000, because now when I round it, it will round to 1,000. So these are 2 possible answers. If you had a number between 995, through 1004, any of those would work as well. Okay, we have our last two. This student rounds 99,498 to the nearest thousand and gets 100,000. What mistake did this person make? Well, let's check here. We're rounding it to the nearest thousand, so we're starting that thousands place value. But remember, if it's 4 or less, we're supposed to let it rest. So our answer that we're going to write would be this: the digit in the hundreds place value is what? It's less than 5. Or we could put is 4 or less, because those are the same thing. So what should she have done? She should have rounded to what? She should have rounded to 99,000. For number B, we have this part. It says, is it possible for a 5-digit number, so that's in the 10,000 place value, to be rounded to a 6-digit number? Well, at first look, it might seem like, hey, that doesn't make any sense at all. But if you remember from this right here, we have an example of a 3-digit number going to a 4-digit number when we round. So it seems like it's possible. So how are we going to explain that? So we're going to explain it by stating that 5-digit numbers, and then we'll show an example after this after you write it down. 5-digit numbers greater than or equal to and we're going to say 95,000, because we have that 5, or we have that 9, the 10,000 spot, and this 5 or bigger is going to make it round up. Round to 100,000 when rounding to the nearest 10,000. And actually, I'm going to, since we're not using the actual number 10,000, we're using the place value, I'm going to write 10,000 out. And then we're just going to put an example. So we would say 96,713. All right, that's it for this lesson. It was kind of easy, but we just had a lot of examples to do. Good job today.